Right now, you probably know the exact time down to the second without even trying. It's on your phone, your wall, your wrist, your microwave, your car dashboard. Time is everywhere, constantly, whether you want it or not. But for the vast majority of human history, there was no clock anywhere on the planet. No watch, no phone, no ticking sound in the background of daily life at all. And yet, ancient people still woke up at roughly the same time, ate meals at roughly the same time, planted crops at the right moment, prayed at scheduled hours, and coordinated entire civilizations, all without a single mechanical timepiece. So how did they actually do it? This is the story of how humans figured out time long before they figured out clocks. Let's start with the most obvious clock ancient humans ever had, one that was already hanging in the sky every single day: the sun. The earliest and simplest way to track time was simply watching where the sun sat in the sky and how long shadows stretched across the ground. A shadow stretching long and thin meant early morning or late evening. A shadow shrinking down to almost nothing underfoot meant midday. This wasn't precise by our standards, but it didn't need to be. For a hunter-gatherer deciding when to head back to camp, or a farmer deciding when to break for a meal, shadows getting long was genuinely useful, actionable information. Eventually, people realized they could make that shadow reading more consistent by controlling the object casting the shadow instead of relying on whatever tree or rock happened to be nearby. This gave us the gnomon, essentially just a vertical stick or pillar planted firmly in the ground, and it's the direct ancestor of every sundial that came after it. The earliest known shadow clocks, simple upright sticks, used specifically to track the sun's movement, date back to around 3500 BCE in ancient Egypt, and they represent one of humanity's very first deliberate time-tracking technologies. As the sun moved across the sky through the day, the gnomon's shadow swept in a predictable arc, and once you'd watched that arc enough times, you could mark specific points on the ground to represent specific portions of the day. This eventually evolved into the sundial as most people picture it, a flat or curved surface with hour markings and a raised edge called a gnomon casting a shadow across them. Ancient Egyptians developed increasingly sophisticated sundials by around 1500 BCE, dividing daylight into a set number of hours. And here's a detail that trips people up. Because ancient sundial hours were based on dividing the actual daylight period into equal segments, an hour in ancient Egypt during summer, when days are long, was a genuinely different length of time than an hour during winter, when days are short. The very concept of a fixed, unchanging hour length is actually a relatively modern invention. For most of history, time itself flexed with the seasons. Sundials had one obvious, enormous flaw. They were completely useless at night, and not particularly helpful on a cloudy day either. So ancient civilizations needed a backup system, something that didn't depend on the sun at all. The answer, developed independently in multiple civilizations, was water. The water clock, technically called a clepsydra, worked on a beautifully simple principle: water dripping at a steady, predictable rate from one container into another. If you knew roughly how much water dripped through in a given period, you could mark lines on the receiving container corresponding to elapsed time, then read off the water level to estimate how much time had passed, day or night, sun or no sun. Ancient Egyptian water clocks date back to at least 1400 BCE, based on archaeological evidence from the tomb of Amenhotep I. These devices were often shaped like a stone vessel with a small hole near the bottom, marked internally with lines representing hours, and priests are believed to have used them specifically to track nighttime hours for religious rituals that needed to happen at precise times, regardless of whether the sun was up to help. The ancient Greeks adopted and refined water clock technology extensively, using clepsydrate to time speeches in legal proceedings, ensuring no single speaker could dominate a trial by talking indefinitely. And genuinely elegant early solution to a problem courtrooms still deal with today. In ancient China, water clock technology developed along its own sophisticated path, eventually evolving into elaborate multi-vessel systems, where water flowed through a cascading series of containers specifically designed to keep the flow rate as consistent as possible over long periods, since a single container's flow rate naturally changes as water pressure drops while it empties. By the Song dynasty, Chinese engineers had built extraordinarily complex water-powered astronomical clock towers, mechanisms combining water clock timekeeping with rotating celestial models, representing some of the most advanced pre-modern timekeeping technology built anywhere in the ancient world. Fire and smoke turned out to be just as reliable as water for tracking time, and in some ways, more portable. Candle clocks worked on an elegantly simple idea. A candle burns down at a fairly predictable, steady rate, so if you mark specific measured intervals along its length, the candle itself becomes a timer as it burns, with elapsed time visible in exactly how much wax has disappeared. Written records describing candle clocks appear in China by around 520 CE. and the concept spread and adapted across multiple cultures afterward. Some versions even had small weights or nails embedded at specific measured points along the candle. As the wax around each weight melted away, the weight would drop and clatter loudly into a metal tray below, functioning as an early, genuinely clever alarm system that required no batteries, no electricity, and no moving parts beyond gravity itself. In China and Japan, incense clocks took this same basic fire-based principle even further. Powdered incense was carefully packed into an intricate, often maze-like or spiral-shaped groove pressed into a tray, and as the incense burned slowly and steadily along that predetermined path, it marked the passage of time visually, and, in many designs, released different scents at specific pre-planned intervals along the way. Some elaborate versions could burn continuously for many hours, or even track through an entire night, and the specific scent released at any given moment could tell you roughly what portion of the night had already passed. No light or visibility required at all, which was especially valuable in dark temples or during religious observances conducted well after sunset. Hourglasses, using sand instead of water or wax, appeared somewhat later than you might expect, with solid historical evidence pointing to their use by sailors in the 14th century. Sand had a genuinely major practical advantage over water for anyone at sea. It doesn't slosh unpredictably or evaporate the way water does on a rocking, humid ship deck, and its flow rate through a narrow glass neck stays remarkably consistent regardless of temperature. Ships' crews used hourglasses specifically to time work shifts and to help calculate their speed and position while navigating open ocean, well before modern instruments existed to do that job for them, making the hourglass a genuinely essential piece of maritime survival technology rather than just a decorative timepiece. Now let's talk about something that operated on a much bigger, slower scale than any single day: the stars themselves. Ancient civilizations paid extraordinarily close attention to which specific stars rose and set at which specific times of year, and this knowledge became absolutely critical for agriculture and for tracking the passage of entire seasons. In ancient Egypt, the heliacal rising of the star Sirius, meaning the very first morning it became visible again on the eastern horizon just before sunrise after a long period of being hidden by the sun's glare, reliably predicted the annual flooding of the Nile River, arguably the single most important agricultural event in the entire Egyptian calendar. Egyptian priests tracked this star rising with genuine precision, and it directly anchored their entire yearly calendar system. Megalithic monuments across the ancient world doubled as enormous, physically permanent astronomical calendars. Stonehenge, built in stages starting around 3000 BCE in what is now England, is precisely aligned so that the sun rises directly over a specific marker stone on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, and sets in alignment with another specific point on the winter solstice, the shortest day. Newgrange in Ireland, built even earlier, around 3200 BCE, features an entrance passage engineered with such extraordinary precision that sunlight only penetrates all the way to its innermost chamber for a few minutes around dawn on the winter solstice, and at essentially no other point during the entire year. These weren't just religious or ceremonial sites built for symbolic reasons. They were functioning, physically massive calendars that ancient societies used to reliably track the changing seasons and to properly time critical agricultural activities like planting and harvesting. Religious life across many ancient and medieval cultures required extremely precise timekeeping too, arguably more precise than everyday secular life demanded. In medieval Christian monasteries, monks structured their entire day around a strict schedule of canonical hours, specific fixed times for communal prayer that had to be observed regardless of season, weather, or how visible the sun happened to be that particular day. Monasteries frequently relied on bells, sundials mounted directly on monastery walls, and even designated monks whose entire assigned job was simply watching the sky and the position of specific stars overnight in order to accurately wake the community at the correct canonical hour for pre-dawn prayers, a role that in many ways functioned as a genuinely dedicated human alarm clock. In the Islamic world, precise timekeeping was similarly essential, since daily prayers are required at 5 specific times tied directly to the sun's position: dawn, midday, mid-afternoon, sunset, and full darkness. This religious necessity drove significant, genuine advances in astronomy and practical timekeeping instrumentation across the Islamic Golden Age. Sophisticated sundials were constructed specifically for mosques, carefully calibrated to local latitude and to the specific religious definitions of when each prayer period technically began and ended. And dedicated timekeepers called muwaqqits were formally employed at major mosques, specifically to calculate and publicly announce accurate prayer times to the surrounding community each day. For most ordinary people throughout most of history, though, the vast majority of daily timekeeping wasn't handled by any dedicated instrument at all. It was handled by simple, deeply familiar natural and social rhythms. Roosters crowing reliably at dawn. Specific flowers opening and closing at fairly predictable characteristic hours. A natural pattern precise enough that some naturalists later attempted to design entire flower clocks, based purely on observing which specific species opened at which specific time of day. Church bells or temple bells or public town criers announcing specific hours across an entire town or village, meaning most people didn't personally need to independently track time at all. They simply needed to be within reliable earshot of whoever or whatever mechanism already was. And there was one timekeeping method more fundamental and more universal than literally any of the others. Your own body. Hunger reliably signals mealtime. Genuine tiredness signals it's time to sleep. The position and warmth of sunlight on your skin gives a rough, usable sense of roughly how far the day has progressed. For the overwhelming majority of human history, internal biological rhythms, what we now call the circadian rhythm, did an enormous, largely unrecognized share of the actual timekeeping work, entirely without anyone needing to glance at any external instrument whatsoever. So when you put all of these ancient systems together, shadows, water, fire, sand, stars, stone monuments, bells, and the body's own internal rhythms, a genuinely striking pattern emerges. Ancient people weren't living in some kind of vague, disorganized haze without any real sense of time, the way modern assumptions sometimes casually paint them. They were reading time constantly, carefully, and with remarkable sophistication, just through completely different signals than the ones we've since come to depend on almost exclusively. They were arguably paying far closer attention to their actual physical environment than most of us do today, because for them, that close attention wasn't a hobby or a mindfulness exercise. It was the only functioning clock they had, and it needed to be accurate enough to plant crops at the right moment, pray at the correct hour, and safely make it back to camp before nightfall actually arrived. The next time you glance down at a phone screen to check the exact time in under a single second, take a moment to consider that, for most of human history, telling time correctly required genuinely understanding the sky, the seasons, the tides, fire, water, and your own body, all at once, all the time, without a single battery or gear involved anywhere in the entire process. What do you think we lost when we stopped needing to pay that kind of attention? Let me know in the comments. Until then, keep an eye on the sky.